From north to south, the Atlantic Ocean spans the 8,000 miles separating the United Kingdom from the group of islands known as the Falklands. To the east of the Falklands lie the uninhabited islands of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Group, which, together with the Falklands themselves, make up the British Falkland Island dependencies. The main islands, little more than 2/3 of the size of Wales, lying 480 miles northeast of Cape Horn. This is Port Stanley, the principal town, indeed the only town in the Falkland Islands. On the 2nd of April 1982, a large and well-equipped Argentine invasion force landed here and besieged the governor, Mr. Rex Hunt, in this, his official residence, Government House. The governor had less than 24 hours warning of the invasion, and 68 Royal Marines constituted the only defence force at his disposal.
They've got us well and truly pinned down, but they're not trying to attack, so I think they're waiting for the armoured personnel vehicles to come. And then I think maybe they'll have another go.
After several hours of determined resistance, when it became clear that the invaders were coming ashore in overwhelming numbers, the governor surrendered, broadcasting his decision to the 1,800 Falkland Islands inhabitants over the island's radio.
Dear friends, I'm afraid I'm not being given the time to say farewell to you all as I would have wished by speaking to each of you personally. But the new Argentine governor has kindly given me permission to send you this last message of good wishes and thanks for all your support in the 2 years I have served here. I shall never forget you and hope that we shall meet again someday. In particular, Mavis and I would like to say farewell to all the Government House staff whom we were not able to see today. Goodbye, and God bless you all.
At home, the Argentine government had overnight won the rapturous support of the Argentine people, for it had given them the Malvinas, as they call the Falklands, and it had done so in a bold show of military might. Britain, they were convinced, was no longer interested in the Falklands and would accept a fait accompli with little more than a token protest. In London, word of the British government's response was eagerly awaited, and it came when the Commons met in emergency session the next day.
The House meets this Saturday to respond to a situation of great gravity. We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete.
The sailing of the task force stimulated a great release of national pride and determination. An act of aggression had been committed on British territory, and Argentina must be persuaded, by force if necessary, to withdraw. There was little thought of war at this stage, no idea in the minds of the public of what the task force might have to do. It was enough that the Falklands were 8,000 miles away. It seemed only prudent to shorten that distance without delay. Meanwhile, intensive efforts to obtain an Argentine withdrawal by diplomatic means were being pursued with the utmost urgency. Sir Anthony Parsons, our ambassador to the United Nations, put our case in the strongest possible terms and pressed for the acceptance by the Security Council of Resolution 502. That an act of aggression had taken place could not be denied, and it was this use of force by Argentina which, when it came to the vote, much to Argentina's surprise and dismay, caused many of her friends on the Security Council to vote against her. Accordingly, Resolution 502 was passed. Now, as news of the task force and Resolution 502 tempered celebrations in Buenos Aires, diplomatic pressure was applied to the Galtieri government.
Any success, Mr. Secretary? Any good news, Mr. Secretary?
Well, we've been very busy and we've done a lot of work.
General Leopoldo Galtieri had come to power just 5 months before the invasion. As commander-in-chief of the army, he headed the three-man military junta grappling with an inflation rate of 150% and with serious internal unrest and bitterness in the wake of a ruthless anti-terrorist campaign, which had itself divided and terrorized the population. Galtieri saw in the long-standing dispute with Britain over the sovereignty of the Malvinas a way of uniting the people and securing his own power base. And he was almost certainly committed to the invasion, either willfully or by the pressure of events, from the moment the Argentine flag was raised on the island of South Georgia, some 700 miles to the east of the Falklands, where, on the 19th of March, a party of Argentine scrap metal merchants was landed without authorization to dismantle the abandoned whaling station at Leith. The following day, the ice patrol ship, HMS Endurance, sailed from Port Stanley with a party of Royal Marines to investigate. She arrived off Grytviken on the 24th, in time to observe the landing of over 100 Argentine Marines at Leith on the 26th. By now, intelligence reports showed the Argentine fleet to be converging on the Falkland Islands. Invasion suddenly became a real possibility. In response, the British government ordered 3 nuclear-powered fleet submarines into the South Atlantic on Monday, the 29th of March. Despite maintaining an average of 23 knots on her long passage south, the first of these formidable vessels did not arrive in the area of the Falklands until 8 days after the invasion on that fateful day of Friday, the 2nd of April, when General Galtieri was able to announce his seizure of the Malvinas to the delight of the Argentine people. In Buenos Aires, unrestrained rejoicing replaced the fierce anti-government rioting of only a few days before. It was not until 6 p.m. on that same Friday that the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, and the Defence Secretary, John Nott, held a press conference to confirm what the world now knew and to give the first government reaction to it.
And so a military option in a time when you have distances of this kind is extremely difficult.
I think it's not possible, even if you have the most brilliant intelligence system in the world, to read the minds of the other side. All I can tell you is that at the beginning of this week there was a naval exercise going on in this area. We had no clear evidence at all that it was going to be directed against the Falkland Islands, and at that time the Foreign Secretary was contemplating moves in the United Nations and among our friends, so that it would have been wrong to dispatch a large task force before we were absolutely certain, which we became last night, that an invasion was imminent.
As these words were being spoken, the First Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, had the mobilization of the largest naval task force this country had assembled since the Second World War well in hand. He was determined to sail the first group on its 8,000-mile voyage south by the following Monday. To delay might have enabled a more ordered loading of the ships, but of greater importance was the need to give the public at home and the rest of the world the clearest possible evidence of the British government's resolve. Nothing could have done this more effectively than the sight of men and ships sailing for the South Atlantic just 3 days after the first Argentine troops landed at Port Stanley. It was to the First Sea Lord's immediate subordinate, Commander-in-Chief Fleet, Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, that overall command of the task force fell. And it was from his headquarters at Northwood that he appointed Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, then commanding the first flotilla of destroyers and frigates exercising in mid-Atlantic, as commander of the Naval Carrier Task Group. One of Admiral Woodward's earliest and most demanding duties in his new role was that of facing the awkward questions of the press and TV journalists accompanying the task force.
How do you feel personally? I mean, no one for years has been put in a position like this. You've got a vast force, a lot of power. How do you feel about exercising it?
I don't know how much power I've got.
Well, firepower.
But I'm the executive. I've got a lot of firepower. Yes, okay, fine. I now know what you're talking about. Yes, I've got a lot of firepower, and if one is given the authority to use it, then I'll use it to the best advantage I can with the training I've had and with the assistance and skills I've got available to me.
As the leading elements of the task force sailed south, they still represented in the eyes of many a means of strengthening Britain's diplomatic hand, rather than a force destined to fight it out with the Argentine invaders. If it came to a fight, however, it was clear from the outset that the decisive battle would have to be fought on land, not at sea. A vital element of the task force, therefore, were the men of 3rd Commando Brigade, who comprised the landing force under Brigadier Julian Thompson.
The brigade was organised with 3 commandos, which are the equivalent of non-mechanised infantry battalions. Gunner support was the 2-9 Commando light regiment, armed with 105 light guns. And then there was a sapper squadron and a logistic regiment, which is unique, actually, in that all the logistic units of the brigade were under one command in the logistic regiment. The training of the brigade was unusual in 2 aspects. One, that the mountain Arctic warfare training, which is unusual, which meant that a lot of men were used to working in wet and cold conditions and were equipped for just that, and many had spent up to 9 or 10 winters in Norway. And the other side that was slightly unusual was the amphibious training, where particularly the staffs and the leaders in the brigade had quite a lot of experience in amphibious operations, which turned out to be quite useful, of course, because training a man to jump in and out of a landing craft or a helicopter is relatively easy. What takes the time is training the staffs and the leaders to put together the amphibious package so that it's right on the day. Getting the shipping together was more of a problem than getting the chaps back, because nobody seemed to believe how much shipping one needed. And it's not so much the shipping for the men, it's the shipping for the combat supplies, without which there's no point in shipping a lot of men down to fight unless you've got bullets to shoot and beans to eat. And the brigade was expanding because we had 3 para added to us who were the spearhead battalion, and we were very glad to see them because we knew quite a lot of them. It was good to have that lot with us. It was also very good to have T Battery, the air defence battery, join us, and 2 troops of the Blues and Royals with their Scorpions and Scimitars. But this meant you needed more ships to move them. Early on, the idea had been to put at least 1 commando in Hermes. But when people thought about the problem in greater depth, they realized that Hermes' main task was going to be providing the main bulk of the air support for the task force, and therefore she couldn't clutter her decks up with helicopters and fill her holds and compartments up with Marines. Of course, the main priority was to get going, get south as fast as possible to show the resolve of the country. Now, this meant that a lot of stuff was just tipped in as fast as it could be, which is no slur on the people who did the tipping, because my goodness me, did they work hard. It did mean, however, that some LSLs arrived south with 18 inches over their loading marks with horrific sort of mixes of ammunition, like fuel and ammunition and so forth, all in the same hold. And so a certain amount of sorting out had to be done when we got down to Ascension. And that time we had there was very useful for that purpose.
Brigadier Thompson, as commander, 3rd Commando Brigade, was one of 3 task group commanders, the other 2 being Commodore Michael Clapp, Commodore, Amphibious Warfare, and Admiral Woodward, the Carrier Task Group Commander. Admiral Fieldhouse, as Commander-in-Chief Fleet, exercised overall command of the operations from his Northwood headquarters, advised by 3 service deputies, Vice Admiral David Halifax, Major General Jeremy Moore, and Air Marshal Sir John Curtis. While the staff at Northwood grappled with the complexities of an out-of-area operation greater than anything undertaken since Suez, Brigadier Thompson and his staff joined the assault ship HMS Fearless by helicopter on the 6th of April, as the task force made best speed towards Ascension Island. For the men of 3 Commando Brigade, an unexpected taste of luxury for their voyage south in their troopship, the liner Canberra. Admiral Fieldhouse, taking a last opportunity to confer with his task group commanders, called a council of war at Ascension, which took place on board HMS Hermes on the 17th of April.
At that council of war, I was told that 2 para had been stood by to join us down in Ascension. This was good news as far as I was concerned. I knew H. Jones. He'd been the BM of a brigade under whose command which I'd served in Northern Ireland, and there were some good chaps in that battalion that I knew, so this was great news to have them coming to join us. At the same time, I was asked by General Moore what force did we require to carry out the aim in the Falkland Islands? Suppose we had to land and invade the islands and carry out a land campaign. And I said, perhaps rather flippantly, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have about equal numbers, which meant about 10,000 men, which meant another brigade, really. And I was then asked, did I think that my brigade headquarters could handle the command of, say, 7 or 8 battalions, to which my answer was no. I reckoned that 5 was as much as we could hack on our own. So that, of course, I believe, led to the decision to bring down another brigade headquarters. After the Council of War, the rest of the ships who had sailed either at the same time as us or indeed after us, the faster ones, arrived at Ascension, and it was particularly good to see the very large white shape of Canberra steaming in, bearing with her 42 Commando, 40 Commando and 3 Para. And I visited her as soon as I could get away, and it was tremendous to see the heart in which the troops were in, particularly, of course, because they had the huge space in which to train and keep fit in this very large ship. And this was an enormous bonus as far as I was concerned, because I knew well from my experience what a problem it is keeping men fit in a ship for long periods. And here was a ship where if you ran round the promenade deck once, that was a quarter of a mile. So you could do marches in equipment, shooting, anything you liked almost, and keep the guys fit. Now the mood in the brigade was one of intense exhilaration, particularly among the younger chaps who thought, well, this is what we're being paid for and this is what it's all about. I think among the older members it was perhaps a little more sombre when we realized, or began to realize, what the odds were, particularly the odds on the air side. And also, a number of us who had been down in that part of the world, and particularly people like the Staff Captain A, Andy Higginson, who'd actually played rugger against these guys and said they're rather like us sometimes, we realized that perhaps they weren't going to chuck the towel in all that easily, because after all, they were there, not very far away from their own country. They had air superiority, so why should they chuck the towel in? So I personally, and some of my senior people, believe that they would fight right from the very beginning.
In the days that followed the meeting at Ascension between Admiral Fieldhouse and his task group commanders, it became clear to all concerned that with Argentina airlifting men and supplies into Port Stanley round the clock, even a much strengthened 3-commando brigade could not be expected on its own to defeat a well-equipped and well-dug-in occupying force, already of at least twice its number, even if, as was known, many of its men were conscripts with a minimum of training. Admiral Fieldhouse decided, therefore, to amend the mission given to Commodore Clapp and Brigadier Thompson from that of repossession of the Falklands to planning for a landing with the view to repossessing the Falklands. In order to accomplish this task, these were the land forces which had now been committed to land and establish a beachhead on the Falkland Islands. 3rd Commando Brigade under Brigadier Thompson, comprising Headquarters, 3-Commando Brigade, 40, 4-2 and 4-5 Commandos, Royal Marines, 2 troops, the Blues and Royals, 2 9-Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, 1 battery of Rapier missile launchers, 2 troops of blowpipe missiles, 5 9 Independent Commando Squadron, Royal Engineers, 2nd and 3rd Battalions, the Parachute Regiment, 3 Commando Brigade Air Squadron, and the Commando Logistic Regiment. South Georgia, the island occupied by Argentine forces on the pretext of protecting a party of illegally landed scrap metal merchants, although strategically unimportant, was now significant as evidence of the resolve of Her Majesty's government. To retake South Georgia, a separate task group was dispatched, commanded by Captain Brian Young of HMS Antrim, and comprising D Squadron, SAS, and M Company, 4-2 Commando. M Company had with them sections of the Reconnaissance Troop, Mortars, and SBS. The task group arrived in the area of South Georgia on the 21st of April. With HMS Antrim was the RFA Tidespring and the ice patrol ship, HMS Endurance. The details of this operation are not our concern here. Suffice to say, an Argentine submarine, the Santa Fe, was put out of action and the surrender taken on the 25th of April of a force of 137 men. Captain Alfredo Astiz signed the surrender document. There were no British casualties. On the 12th of April, with the nuclear-powered submarine HMS Spartan on station off Port Stanley, Her Majesty's government declared a 200-mile maritime exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands. By the time South Georgia was retaken on the 25th, Admiral Woodward's carrier battle group was just 4 days steaming from the exclusion zone, while Brigadier Thompson and 3 Commando Brigade remained on board their ships off Ascension, awaiting the arrival from the UK of 2 Para in the ferry Norland. With the addition of 2 and 3 Para, 3 Commando Brigade was a formidable fighting force. But clearly, once a beachhead had been established, more troops would be needed to recapture the Falklands if the Argentines decided to fight. Accordingly, MOD Army alerted its out-of-area force, the 5th Infantry Brigade, with orders to prepare to sail for the South Atlantic, although it could not then be known whether it would have a fighting or a post-operational role. When 5 Brigade joined 3 Commander Brigade in the beachhead, the land forces, then at approximately divisional strength, would be commanded by General Moore, whose role, meanwhile, remained at Northwood, providing military advice to Admiral Fieldhouse.
While we were travelling south to Ascension, and indeed while we were at Ascension, the landing force element was making its plans for what it wanted to do when we got down there, i.e. where we would like to land in order to get ourselves to Stanley, and a number of considerations had to be brought to bear at that stage. And the planning for that was done in this cabin here, which is my day cabin, and I planned in here with our group. When we got to the stage where we thought we knew what we wanted to do, we had to then make certain that it was what the Navy could actually do, because there's no point on a joint operation in going ahead on your own, ignoring the other half that's got to get you there, protect you while you're there, and support you while you're there. Now, this was quite easy, because all I had to do in order to consult the Navy was go and see the Commodore Amphibious Warfare, Commodore Mike Clapp, who was in a cabin next door to mine, and I just used to go through the door and see him whenever I needed to consult with him. Mike, you remember at Ascension, Admiral Fieldhouse told us to produce 3 options.
Yes.
Which we did.
Yes.
And as I remember, the options were Cow Bay, Volunteer Bay, Capamenta, Salvador,
yes,
and San Carlos.
Yes.
And then I rather wanted to have a 4th option into the Berkeley Sound.
Yes.
And I can't remember now what it was that you were unhappy about Berkeley Sound.
Well, I was only unhappy in the extent, I think, that you and South Petrolia had reported in the sailing days that he'd met a fairly heavy swell in there, which would have made ship-shore movement difficult, particularly with the Mexifleets.
Yeah.
While Admiral Woodward's carrier battle group continued south, and Commodore Clapp, Brigadier Thompson and their staffs studied the options for an amphibious landing, there was increasing acceptance in Britain and around the world that the task force would probably have to fight to remove Argentine troops from the Falklands. On the diplomatic front, with the powerful support of United Nations Resolution 502, Britain retained the initiative throughout April. But in spite of an energetic spate of shuttle diplomacy by the United States Secretary of State, General Alexander Haig, a negotiated withdrawal by Argentina seemed increasingly remote. On the 29th of April, Admiral Woodward's battle group, assembled just outside the maritime exclusion zone, received a signal from Northwood. In all respects, prepare for war by midnight, 29th April. The sea and air battle had begun. On Saturday, the 30th of April, the 200-mile maritime exclusion zone around the Falklands was declared a total exclusion zone, and a single Vulcan bomber of 101 Squadron Strike Command took off from Ascension Island. Its target, the runway at Stanley Airport. By the time it had dropped its bombs early on Sunday morning, the ships of the carrier battle group were well inside the total exclusion zone, and a force of 12 Sea Harriers from Hermes flew off to attack key enemy targets, the radar installation and runway at Stanley, and the enemy base at Goose Green. When it came, the predicted enemy air attack in retaliation did little damage, with the loss of 2 Mirage fighters and a Canberra bomber on the Argentine side. All 3 victims of the versatile Sea Harrier. On the 2nd of May, the Argentine heavy cruiser General Belgrano was being shadowed in the vicinity of the total exclusion zone by the nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror. The cruiser's presence posed a clear and unacceptable threat to the task force, and the submarine was ordered to attack. The sinking of the General Belgrano stunned the Argentine Navy, which subsequently took no major part in the campaign. The Argentine reaction came just 2 days later, an attack by super-étendard strike aircraft equipped with air-launched Exocet missiles. Their intended target was one of the carriers. In fact, they found the destroyer HMS Sheffield in their path, on picket duty southeast of the Falklands, 20 miles ahead of the battle group. Sheffield was hit amidships. On fire and crippled, she was abandoned. Later, when under tow, she sank. The loss of Sheffield to a single Exocet missile had a profound effect on subsequent naval tactics, obliging Admiral Woodward to keep his battle group well to the east, beyond the range of air-launched Exocet, and therefore beyond the range of the Argentine Air Force altogether. Thus, the vital air battle, which, it had been planned, would be fought and won before any landing was undertaken, never took place, and air superiority, an important assumption in the planning of Commodore Clapp and Brigadier Thompson, was not achieved. On the 5th of May, the day after the loss of Sheffield, Admiral Woodward signalled northward to the effect that the task force could only remain operational for another month, the determining factor being aircraft serviceability in the grueling conditions of the South Atlantic in winter. The amphibious task group was at last ordered to sail from Ascension on the 9th of May. Final confirmation of the mission was received by the task group commanders on the 12th, to land with the view to repossessing the Falklands.
And as far as I, the landing force commander, was concerned, to achieve that mission, I had 3 possible tactical options. And they were to land at Cow Bay, Volunteer Bay, or Capamenta, Salvador, or San Carlos. Now, you'll notice that those are all on the northern half of East Falkland, and the reason for that was that I did not want to land anywhere that would bring me up to Stanley from the southeast or the south, because that seemed to me to be the obvious way to come, and furthermore to come into the defensive position on the strongest side. So all the time I was looking to come in from the north or northwest into Stanley.
The first 2 options, Volunteer Bay and the entrance to San Salvador, became less and less attractive to me. I wanted somewhere where I could hide from Exocet for a start. Although they didn't have many Exocet, I wasn't prepared to actually buy one of them. San Carlos stood out, as far as I was concerned, very early on as being my ideal. It gave me protection from Exocet, it gave me some protection by conventional air attack, and it gave me sheltered waters. So about 3 weeks before the chosen date of landing, we put in the SBS to explore the beaches and check that they would be suitable, and to look at the hinterland for the landing force commander.
One of the peculiarities of the SBS beach reconnaissance role is the conflict between avoiding compromise and gaining as much information as possible. And by that I mean, if the enemy know that there are people looking at his beaches, he's got a finite number of places in which to look. So the patrols have to be extremely careful. It may well be that the patrols can carry out half their job and get away with it and come back without information, when if they try to do the whole thing, they may cause a compromise, which would have all sorts of unfortunate results. And in the San Carlos, Port San Carlos area in particular, the Brigadier was very clear that we were not to be compromised. Had we been compromised, had our positions been compromised by swimmers being seen in the water, making too long a radio transmission from the hillside, and had the Argentinians as a result moved a battalion into the area, the result would have been a disaster. And that is the nature of the compromise that SBS patrols always have to make in the beach intelligence role.
Well, in any situation like this, there are obviously 3 very distinct types of operation which are carried out by special forces in support of the main landing forces. The first one being the gathering of strategic intelligence, the second one being operations carried out prior to the landings, which are designed to both deceive and also cause attrition to the enemy forces. And finally, there are the direct land operations in support of the landings themselves and also in operations which may take place subsequent to those landings. In the first type of operation, the strategic gathering of intelligence, the SAS were deployed into 6 different locations, which were really chosen off a map because it must be realized that prior to the landings there was absolutely no knowledge, no real knowledge of where the enemy dispositions were, and therefore 6 positions were picked off a map, both in East and West Falklands, and the SAS were landed there over a period of 3 nights by helicopter, starting on the night of the 30th of April, the 1st of May.
The first SAS and SBS reconnaissance patrols began to provide valuable intelligence data on the location and strength of Argentine forces on East Falkland early in May. They reported the area around San Carlos Water to be entirely free of troops. On the 8th of May, it was decided to go firm on San Carlos as the site for the landing. The penalty? 50 miles of rough, boggy and inhospitable country that lay between San Carlos and the principal objective, Port Stanley. This, however, was beyond the scope of the immediate landing plan, first revealed to his commanding officers by Brigadier Thompson at a briefing on board HMS Fearless on the 13th of May.
And what I wanted to achieve was by first light be on the high ground, in reverse slope positions, ready to fly in the Rapiers and the guns in order to beat off air attacks and any ground counterattacks as soon as possible. Now, to achieve that, I had a 3-phase landing plan. In phase 1, by landing craft at night, I was going to land 2 para, closely followed, almost simultaneously with 40 Commando, at San Carlos settlement. 2 para's mission was to get up onto the high ground Sussex Mountain as quickly as possible to block off any possible approach from the strategic reserve, which we thought was in the Darwin area, coming in onto the beachhead. Forty Commando were to secure the settlement and then get up onto the high ground at the back of the settlement. And then in phase 2, which I planned should be again in darkness by landing craft, simultaneously 45 Commando would seize the Ajax Bay complex and then get up onto the high ground to the west of it, while 3 para landed at Port San Carlos, or rather to the west of Port San Carlos, cleared the settlement and then got up again onto the high ground overlooking the settlement. And my reserve for those 2 phases was to be 42 Commando afloat in Canberra. Phase 3 was the first time that we started using helicopters and wouldn't start until first light, and then using helicopters and landing craft, I would land the batteries of the Commando Regiment and the Rapier Battery, still keeping 42 Commando afloat as my reserve.
On the 19th of May, Commodore Clapp received the signal from C&C Fleet authorizing him to undertake the landing at dawn on the 21st. By now, the total Harrier strength available to the task force had risen to 35, thanks to the arrival of the container ship Atlantic Conveyor, bringing an additional 12 aircraft. A further 4 RAF GR3 Harriers were flown from Britain via Ascension. Although they were to play a vital part in the rest of the campaign, providing both air defense and close air support, it was during that most hazardous of phases, the landing and securing of the beachhead, that their contribution was to prove crucial. The greatest threat to the success of the landings being that posed by the Argentine Air Force. In order to reduce that threat, Special Forces attacked an airstrip on Pebble Island a few days before the landings, destroying a number of Pucara ground attack aircraft based there, only a short flying time from the San Carlos beaches.
Following Pebble Island, and shortly before the main landings took place, another operation of this nature was carried out by a 4-man patrol of SAS who were positioned at that time in the Mount Kent area. They were able to observe over a period of time the whereabouts, which continually changed, incidentally, of the helicopter force, which was used to provide mobility for the main strategic reserve for the Argentine forces in the whole of the Falkland Islands. By identifying exactly where the Argentines were hiding these helicopters at night, they were able to call in an airstrike about 2 days before the main landings and totally destroyed the ability of the Argentines to move their strategic reserve around the islands by helicopter.
As the amphibious task group entered Falkland Sound under cover of darkness on the night of the 20th of May, the cloud, which had been solid all day, cleared, greatly increasing the vulnerability of men and ships to air attack. H-hour was set for 0330 hours on the 21st of May. Because no decisive air battle had been fought, the best they could expect was local air parity over San Carlos. In the preceding hours, a series of diversionary actions was mounted, including a naval bombardment to the south of Stanley and a raid by special forces.
A few hours before H-hour, on D-Day, a very successful raid was carried out by an SAS squadron landing by Sea Kings at night north of Darwin, and then they went in and assaulted Darwin. The aim, as far as I was concerned, of that raid was to keep the strategic reserve, which we thought was in the Darwin area, busy, and their eyes off what we were doing further to the north of them in San Carlos water.
For a period of 6 or 7 hours, they were able to delude the Argentine forces into thinking that at least a force of a battalion in strength of British troops had landed in the area of Darwin Goose Green, and they did this by a massive use of their own squadron firepower, including mortars, rocket launchers, etc.
It was a highly successful raid. Indeed, afterwards we discovered from intelligence that the Argentines thought they'd been attacked by a battalion, and then the SAS squadron rounded it off. As they were withdrawing from it in daylight, they were attacked by aircraft, and they shot one of them down with a Stinger, so they had every reason to feel very pleased with themselves at the end of that.
Crucial to the security of the landing operation was the control of the high ground commanding the entrance to San Carlos water, known as Fanning Head. Several days earlier, when they were withdrawn, SBS patrols had reported Fanning Head, like everywhere else adjacent to the landing area, to be free of Argentine forces. By the night of the landing, this was no longer the case.
We had an indication that there was an Argentinian force of some description, probably a company minus, on one of the major hill features and probably on the Fanning Head feature. Our problem was we only had a few hours in which to find these enemy in an area not much smaller than about half of Dartmoor. We were fortunate in that we had just got from Warminster a thermal imager camera and a small team of experts who could teach us how to use it. And this, I think, was the first ever use of thermal imaging, or TI, in war.
The special camera was mounted in a helicopter, which proceeded to sweep the ground from a height of about 1,000 feet in darkness, only hours before the landing was due to take place. When analysed on board Antrim, the recording revealed the exact locations of the Argentine troops. They were indeed on Fanning Head, overlooking the route into San Carlos water, shortly to be taken by the landing craft. An immediate SBS attack was launched.
The force that was going up onto Fanning Head was carrying with it a small handheld TI device, which enabled them to pinpoint exactly the men on the ground when the firefight started. And by using naval gunfire support, we had our own spotter from 148 battery with us. We were able to bring down very accurate fire from Antrim, from her 2 guns out in the bay, literally as the men in the landing force were getting into their landing craft and sailing into San Carlos water. The firefight was going on.
We knew that we would be the first troop ashore, and my section were told that we would be the point section, therefore I would be the first section commander ashore. We managed to cram ourselves into the landing craft. They were quite full, and away we went.
Once we were upon the LSUs, it was a sense of relief mixed with anticipation. Relief of getting off the boat, but the anticipation where you're not quite sure what that you're going to go into. And as we're in there and we're sort of bobbing around in the water, you can see Tracer arcing through on Fanning Head, where there was a battle going to quash some platoon of Argentinians, and ship-to-shore fire was going on, which heightened it. But at this time, you look around your young lads, and you can see that they're keen for it, and there's a lot of humour flying around. You get the odd joke that we're in a rubbish skip, and rubbish skips don't float too well and things like this. Then we steamed off towards the shore, and you can see in the outline the silhouette of the islands coming closer, and you're wondering what it's going to be like. I mean, it's the first time that you're actually going into something, and as the Colonel briefed us before we actually embarked on this venture, it'd be something like Gallipoli, where you're told what's going to happen, and it probably won't happen that way.
We could hear the shells from the frigates pounding into the features all around the beachhead, which is quite reassuring and also a bit frightening, made you think what was happening. My next task was to look over the bow and as we approached the beach and see if I could see a member of the SBS team flashing some signals to let me know whether or not the landing was to be opposed or the beach was mined. Unfortunately, we didn't see any signals from the SBS, and therefore we didn't know what in actual fact was going to happen.
About 50 metres out from the shore, when everybody is expecting the front to go down and you're expecting to go storming off and grab yourself a piece of the Falklands and claim it and put it in your pockets back for dear old England and things, the ramps don't go down and you suddenly find that you're stuck on a sandbank.
Despite encounters with minor obstacles like sandbanks, all 4 units had no difficulty securing their objectives. In the north, 3 para, the high ground above Port San Carlos. In the east, 40 Commando, the high ground of the Verde Mountains, above San Carlos settlement. In the west, 4-5 Commando, the hills above Ajax Bay. And in the south, 2 para, the Sussex Mountains, blocking any advance by the enemy garrison at Goose Green.
The dawn of D-Day broke reasonably to my satisfaction. We were late in a number of areas, but nothing too critical. The 7 escorts I had were deployed outside St. Carlos. 3 were on gun lines in support of the land forces, and they were essential until the 105s were in place and zeroed in. And I hoped to provide defence in depth for air as well, although I realised that modern ships' radars and things don't work too well in confined waters. I didn't actually expect it to work quite the way it did. The air attack, sure enough, came, and so I set it up rather like a duck shoot. And I kept Fearless at one end and Intrepid at the other, with the amphibious civilian LSLs in the middle, and to give them some protection from that approach, and the escorts were arranged outside. This worked quite well, and I was grateful, there's little else I can say, really, that the Argentinians were decoyed off onto the surface ships and didn't press home into St. Carlos and take out the amphibious ships. And so at the end of the day, not a single amphibious ship was badly damaged and nothing had stopped. The helicopters continued flying, the landing craft had continued operating. And so the essential task had still gone on, and the military were getting established. We did suffer a fairly heavy toll. Ardent, who was on the gun line supporting the SAS on their attack on Darwin, was sunk because she was isolated and I had not sufficient ships to give her mutual support. Antrim was damaged, Brilliant was damaged, Argonaut was very badly damaged and was towed into St. Carlos, where she remained for about 10 days, repairing herself as an excellent air defence control platform. I was told that Canberra had been hit, I should think, about a dozen times. Various ships were all sunk 3 or 4 times over. I had no means of knowing. There were broadcasts and different voice reports going on, and from where we were in the Fearless, we could only see a few of the ships in the anchorage, and we were not in communications with the entire team. I wasn't, in strict terms, in control. It was impossible. We had made our plan, and I had to rely on the various captains to carry it out, which they did without any prompting, and the initiatives they took were exactly the ones I wanted them to take, which was gratifying, and continued that way for the rest of the operation.
D-Day went on the whole very well, and at the end of it I was very satisfied. There were 1 or 2 small slips. Second phase did not go in darkness, but went in daylight, and the reason for that was that 2 para took much longer to load into their landing craft from Norland than anticipated, and this was caused by the master of Norland lowering his lifeboats to half position, which slowed up the loading of the battalion into its landing craft. And, of course, the offload was considerably slowed up by air attacks which went on through the day, but that didn't prevent the landing craft crews and helicopter crews carrying on. So by last light on D-Day, I was pretty satisfied. I had all 5 of my battalions or commandos ashore, all my guns were ashore, my air defense was ashore, and my ammunition was starting to come ashore, and I was in a good position to beat off attacks from the air and from the ground.
By nightfall, the beachhead was secure. The commandos and para-battalions on the high ground around San Carlos Water consolidated their positions. To their relief and surprise, there'd been no sign of Argentine counterattack. Brigadier Thompson had every justification for satisfaction. But what next? How would the successful landing be converted to victory and the recapture of Stanley? When would the land forces break out of their beachhead and bring the Argentine forces to battle? This was the concern of General Moore, who, having flown to Ascension on the 19th of May, was now steaming rapidly south in QE2 with 5 Brigade. He was to be virtually incommunicado for the next 7 days, and therefore unable to influence events. Responsibility must continue to rest with Brigadier Thompson, based on the directive he had received from General Moore on the 12th of May.
You are to secure a bridgehead on East Falkland, into which reinforcements can be landed, in which an airstrip can be established, and from which operations to repossess the Falkland Islands can be achieved.